Hi there. Welcome to the Culture of Life podcast from Human Life International. I'm Tad Wojcik, the Mission Research Specialist, here with Father Shannon Bouquet, our president.
Tad, good to be with you one more time.
Yes, absolutely, Father, just like always. Today we're talking about your article on Ukraine and, it's really on surrogacy, but highlighted by the conflict going on in Ukraine. So I jumped the gun there, but what prompted the discussion here on surrogacy, Father, and then what is it? Because some people, me included, might not even be super familiar with the topic itself.
Sure. Well, as in all the spirit in life, Tad, really try to evoke from people, the reader, but also those that may be hearing something for the first time, to consider some of the ethical issues that are happening that affect humanity, affects human beings. And so what we're seeing and happening in Ukraine right now, of course, is really the headline, of course, this moment of time, this aggression, this war. And so people are really, kind of being introduced to this part of the world and maybe really don't know all the other aspects that are happening in other parts of the world, like in Ukraine before the war with regard to surrogacy, because it's one of the only few countries that actually allows surrogacy to happen and actually has created an industry for it. So when this story came to the headlines because of the war, because many of the headline media have been picking these stories up and bringing them to the forefront of people's minds about, the difficulties that women who are actually surrogate, and are having children for couples in other parts of the world. And now these children that are being carried by these women are coming to term, being born. And because of the war, the parents of these children who by adoption or by contract don't have access. They can't get to the children. And so this has now come to the headline. And so this is what brought my attention to it. So not so much the issues that are happening in Ukraine with regard to the war, but as much as what is this story about the surrogacy, about the exploitation of women, about these children that are being conceived in these manners, and how they're being commodified, how children are being exploited, as a commodity that people can purchase and, enter into a formal contract with women who are themselves being exploited in these situations. And so this is what brought my attention. This is what I wanted to talk about. So it's an important story because it's not just Ukraine where we see these kinds of stories, but other parts of the world too, where we have poverty, where we have people living in very difficult situations, and they think that this might be the only way for them to overcome their poverty, their economic situation. And so people who have means, to quote unquote, spend lots of money through in vitro fertilization techniques, which I know we'll talk about in a little while. But so basically you can see how this becomes a financial issue. It becomes an opportunity for people to make money. And at the base of all this, obviously, is the human person that's being trafficked, being sold, being created, because someone wants a particular child or, is looking because they can't conceive, or maybe we have same-sex couples that are wanting to be parents. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this and to address these issues.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it, Father. It's a big, complex topic with all kinds of interrelated elements to it. So maybe we can just start from the basics and talk about, you talked about how Ukraine is highlighting this phenomenon of surrogacy at the moment, but just maybe let's lay the groundwork on what exactly is surrogacy, what constitutes that process.
So let's start with, with a difficulty that, and let's just talk about married couples, husbands and wives. This is really kind of in one way, one part of the equation. So you might have a couple that's struggling with infertility. So they themselves are unable to conceive a child for whatever reason. And so what happens with the in vitro fertilization industry, so by in vitro fertilization means simply this. Let's talk about this particular couple, a husband and wife. So what happens is this particular biomedical industry takes the sperm and the egg from the husband and wife, and then they bring it into a laboratory where then not just one, is fertilized, but multiple eggs are fertilized. And then basically the child is engendered, created inside of a petri dish in vitro.
Well, it sounds like many children,
right. And so in some cases, Tad, it depends on, again, what the laboratory is trying to achieve. And so then the children, and like you said, that are that are engendered. Some are put into a frozen state to be used at another time, maybe by that same couple who maybe want more children. And then in some sad situations, which this already is in a very sad situation, because this is not how a child should be welcomed, engendered, in this means. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. But the reality is that this is one aspect. And so what happens with some of the children that may be not being welcomed by the parent, maybe they want one child, two children, but you still might have 4 or 5, 6 children from this same couple. And what happens sometimes is the remaining children are put up for adoption for other couples. Sometimes they are used in experimentation, the whole industry that we see in the biomedical world today. But meaning these are human beings. This is nascent, very nascent, young human life. And so we see how this is exploited. So this is one aspect of it. So here we have a couple who struggles with the difficulty of being infertile. And that's one mechanism that we see not only in Ukraine, many other parts of the world. But another aspect of that, you can have a same-sex couple that wants to be parents. So obviously, a same-sex couple, male, and 2 males cannot donate an egg, all right? And no more than 2 women can donate sperm. So obviously, there could be a couple of factors that come in. That's what makes it so complicated to talk about, because there's so many complexities to it. So in the first situation, we have a husband and wife who donate, the sperm and the egg. So the child that is engendered is a biological child of these 2 people. Whereas what I'm talking about now with a same-sex couple, maybe one of them may be the actual donor. So, but then there is an outside donor, a third party that's brought in that has to donate the sperm or the egg. So, and in some cases, what we've seen is family members, get involved and maybe want to help out. So they may be the donor. So there may be a known donor, but in most cases, it's an unknown person that is donated to a donor bank. So, and this is where what happens. And so this is just a couple of examples of the complexity of this. So what happened in Ukraine, which actually has supported this industry, it's actually created an industry, a very lucrative industry that I talk about in the column, where, you're speaking of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars that are made, in this whole industry. That's why I called it a multi-billion-dollar industry, actually,
Right.
because you're talking about so much money that is being, made by the in vitro fertilization aspect of it, the whole industry of lawyers and contracts that are created between, let's say, the couple who wants to hire a woman to carry their child. That's what the surrogacy, someone's carrying their child. And that woman could be in Africa. She could be in Latin America. She can be in India. She could be in Ukraine. She could be in any part of the world. And there is a contract that's established. And so much money is offered, for her to carry their child. And then there's so much they give to that person to take care of them daily, hospital care, OBGYN care, all the very layers, food, shelter, all through this process. And at the end of that moment, when the child is given birth, then the child is turned over. And so that creates another layer, because, now you have this woman who is mother of this child, who's carried this child, and may not be necessarily the donor. It might not be of her egg that has been used to conceive this child. By in vitro fertilization, they have taken the conceived, go back to that first couple, the husband and wife. So they've taken the child conceived in vitro, and now they've implanted that nascent life, that young embryonic life, into the womb of the surrogate.
And would you say in most cases that it's that situation, whether it's the husband and wife initially or a same-sex couple donating either sperm or egg, as the case may be, with either an unknown or a known person donating the other corresponding part, or is it, I think it's a gamete, I'm not sure what the technical term is, but anyway, or is it the woman donating the egg more common? Usually it's entirely foreign. It's just someone else's, 2 other people's baby in her body.
Exactly.
Right?
And sometimes usually it could be the surrogate. That changes the layer now, because this is also now her child.
Right.
So of her own biology. So it's not her womb that has been rented, if you will, if I use that terminology, but it's also the fact that she herself has donated the egg that has been fertilized, or the eggs in this case, because as you said earlier, it's not just one egg that is fertilized, and it's many eggs that are fertilized, and so many children are conceived in vitro, in glass, in these laboratories. So, but you can see that she's now at a moment where she's given birth to either her biological child, or as you said, in many cases, sometimes I would have to see numbers. I don't know off the top of my head in the sense of statistic, but the idea that, that now, even if it's not her biological child, she has nurtured this child. She has sacrificed all things for this child. She's cared for this child. She's eaten properly. She's been taken care. And now she's been told she has to give up this child. And in some cases, there's been legal battles on this, especially here in the United States, where she's given birth and she doesn't want to give this child up. And so that's created a whole nother layer. That's why I'm saying there's so much of the multi-billion-dollar industry. So it's not just one aspect of the industry that I'm speaking about. I'm talking about the whole complexity of that industry. Because like in Ukraine, there are agencies that are actually in existence that are in a sense like an agency for, you want to be a model. All right, you go to this agency and they're going to get you hired and get you for this job.
Like a surrogacy agency.
They're surrogacy agencies. And so they're making money. You have to pay them a fee as well for them to manage and to oversee and then to find viable candidates. So you can see how even the language, Tad, it really is so dehumanizing. This whole thing is about the dehumanization of human beings, which is what we're talking about. So I always begin with in these kinds of conversations about surrogacy is the exploitation of women, because this is what the first stage. We can see the exploitation of human life, and we'll come back to that in a few moments. But in many cases, we're talking about women in different parts of the world that are in difficult situations of life. Many of them in poor countries. And they see this as a means. So there's your first exploitation, because who can afford this? Who can pay these tens of thousands of dollars, to have this opportunity available to them? Only people with means, which means a lot of them are coming out of the West, where they have the financial means. And where are they going? And they're going to other countries, looking for opportunity where women, are willing to rent out their womb. And so they're exploiting women
because
in these situations because of the poverty, financial difficulties. And as we see in the Ukraine in some of the stories, which really are heart-wrenching, because you have surrogate mothers who have their own biological children, that the media is picking up on. And they're trying to get back, to the Ukraine where they can give birth to their children. And, they've sent their own children and family outside of Ukraine to be safe. But they're there in Ukraine because if they go to another country where surrogacy is illegal, well, what are they going to do? So you can see the tensions that are created here. And then you have the people in the West who, again, because a child is a commodity, ownership, they own this child. That's the mindset. So they have a right to this child. And so the media, of course, picks this up and, and plucks on the strings, and trying to, again, keeping this an emotionally charged situation. But no one stops to think about the fact that, the rest of the story, the fact that this is an industry that's creating children in laboratories and through means of science, implanting this new life into the wombs of women in different parts of the world who willingly, freely, I question whether or not there's free consent, but that's a different conversation, because when people are feeling, they have no other choice, they're looking for means to survive, and this is a way to do that.
It's quite potentially under duress.
There's a lot of issue here. And then, of course, you have women who freely know what they're doing, and they want to do this, and they do it multiple times. I mean, that's another story. But in this situation that I'm raising is that in most cases, these are women that are having difficulties and looking for financial means to support their family. And this is one way to do it. And again, as I say in the article, you can be paid up to 10, 11, 15, even thousands of dollars, even more, plus all the benefits that come with it during that actually a little longer, because they are brought into the conversation before they're even impregnated, and so this is a long journey that can be very lucrative, not just, for the woman who's looking to make some money off the situation, but for the agencies, the people that are out there looking and searching. So, and then
The lawyers.
the lawyers that get involved in this, because if you're talking about a contract, well, someone's got to manage that contract. So I think what's important in the column that I'm really hoping the reader will catch is to really begin to ask questions. What are we doing here to begin with? How do we get to the point where human life is at this level, where basically I want to say this being respectful to human life, but it's like going to the grocery store, and buying something. What am I going to choose today? What color am I going to, car I want to purchase? What color suit am I going to buy? Because here you get into all the genetics, and you get into all the designer issues that people like to talk about. The fact that if there is a genetic abnormality, for example, in these situations at that very early stage, the contract would say the child is to be aborted, to be terminated. Now we got an abortion issue that we have to get into. And then we have to deal with the fact that we have other human life that has been generated in this manner. What happens to them?
You mean in vitro,
In vitro.
during the IVF procedure?
The whole embryonic stem cell industry that's out there looking to take advantage of these moments as well. What happens to these beautiful children that are in a frozen state, that are perpetually left there because the parents of those children have no desire to have any more children, and don't want to see them adopted by anyone else, or want them to be used by science? So what happens to these children? And we've learned these children live indefinitely in this state. So what happens to these children? Is this the way that God created, wants us to have life brought into this world? The answer is no. And so the question always is, how did we get here? Why are we here? Why is this happening? And how do we remedy the situation?
It's Brave New World. I mean, it's almost exactly like that novel, because they have
that's right.
external incubation and gestation.
Correct. That's right. And then if I may add to that, just since you brought that up, we're not going to talk about it too much.
Yeah.
That'd be another time. But there is that the external womb, that's now being, that is coming into this conversation where they're going to be able to actually provide an external womb, all right, an artificial womb where life can be generated and nurtured and cared for till birth. That is there. That science is getting closer and closer to reality, which then takes this now where surrogacy, will no longer be the means by which we don't need surrogacy now. We can now have an artificial womb. And again, not to change that subject, but you can see where these moral dilemmas will come in. So you can see one side of the equation saying, well, wouldn't that be a good thing? Because we have maybe, the mother can't carry the child. Maybe there was a difficulty that was happening. Now there'll be a way that medicine and science can help. If we talked about it on that level, okay, that's one conversation. But we also know what happens. It also becomes a means for so many other things that move beyond.
Commodification
That's
of
correct.
human life.
And that's what's going on here. And sadly, in Ukraine, which is what the story is about, but we can talk about this going on in India. We can talk about this going on in Africa and Latin America
Right,
as
and
well.
the only reason Ukraine comes up is basically because the mainstream media takes advantage of the war crisis,
Right.
coupled with the individual crises of these families, or
Right.
these surrogate mothers,
Right.
caught between their own families and,
Right.
the
But also
children they're bringing in their
but also
womb.
the couples that are in other countries, because they're looking at the situation in Ukraine and wanting to know where are their children, because they have. And I say this very respectfully. I can't. Obviously, I know there's good intent, in people's minds and hearts. In a sense of care, but they're thinking about, where is my child? How am I going to get my child? I paid good money, to have this done. What's going to happen, if I don't have access to my child? And again, because we so dehumanized that little child, that beautiful, precious child, into this industry, and then we've exploited the women in those situations, and we've also, using this industry that we see out there in the in vitro fertilization industry. Here we are, and at the end of the day, these are the kinds of moral dilemmas that are occurring because we don't know how to tell ourselves no.
Sounds like everyone's a victim here, especially the child, but the women, the surrogate mothers,
Absolutely.
and then even the donors are,
To some degree,
in many
yes.
cases,
Yeah.
victims. At least they're falsifying their own ability
Right.
to.
It's a mindset. It's a mindset that's been created. So again, as I brought up in the very beginning, when we first started, our conversation was, so you have a couple that struggles with infertility. So you can see that this is the natural desire for a child. But as we learned from our church's teaching that no one has a right to a child. A child is not something that we own. A child has rights too, to be raised by their biological parents, to be conceived, in a natural way by their loving parents in the conjugal act, to be nurtured and welcomed in the womb of their own biological mother, and then to be birthed by their mother, and then to be raised by their parents. So this is the rights of a child that come to bear, that no one seems to be concerned. So the struggles of couples with infertility is a real, and it's an issue that needs to be pastorally dealt with, and to help couples who are struggling, and to point them in virtuous ways to address those issues, which the church does talk about, and actually the church does have answers to guide them in moral means to find ways to help them to conceive. And so, but this is not the way in which we want to see this move, where it becomes, completely, in such a sterile environment outside of what God intends for husbands and wives and for his children. And so this is what happens. So you use that word, Tad, of falsification. That's a good word, So what we see here is a falsification of goods. And we see what happens when we falsify these. It creates this whole plethora of problems that we see. And the sad thing is what's not told in the story, though I allude to it, is what happens if as this whole process goes, that maybe there is an abnormality. I talked about it a little earlier. What happens as we move further along in the development of the child, within the womb of the surrogate mother? And maybe there's a physical abnormality that begins to be reflected and manifested. Maybe the child does not have the characteristics that are being seen that they wanted. So by contract, you can see how the language might say, well, then that child should be terminated and we'll try again. So you can see what happens to this child. From the very beginning, the child is treated as a commodity in the desire, not in the natural want of a child, again, which is a natural desire between a husband and wife, open to life, wanting to have children, a beautiful blessing. But then moving in this direction where now the child is now seen as a right. I have a right to a child. No. This is where Donum Vitae speaks about this, and where so many of the church's teaching talks about this. And so we can see how
that's
this...
the 1987 CDF document, Donum Vitae.
Exactly.
Gift of life.
Yeah. So I think it's, the goal here was to do, and I know what we're doing right now, and I'm hoping that as the listener is listening to this discussion, that it's kind of raising, like it does in myself when I write these stories and I talk about them, kind of an unsettledness. And it's a sense that there's something wrong here.
I know, I'm pretty perturbed.
Because what I think about here, at the end, so even knowing the immorality of these issues, but we're still talking about a human life. As I talk about it at the end of my column, that no matter how this life has come into being, so in this method, this is a child that's precious, deserves to be loved, has human dignity, and has rights. And so, so here we are saying that, even if we have found, this moment where a child has been conceived, engendered in such a manner, this child has no less dignity than a child conceived in the natural act between husband and mother.
It's a child of God.
Exactly. But we don't want to be here again. And that's the goal here, is by raising this up, Tad, is we need to stop this. This is what we need to stop, and we need to move in a direction that respects the child, the rights of the child, respects women, that not to be used, for someone else's gain. And
not an assembly line.
Exactly. And what's not in the story is, which there are many stories like this, you have husbands and wives, and wives of in other countries that, they don't want to go through the biological process of a child developing in their womb. I've read articles and stories and heard stories where, women, some women, don't want the stretch marks. They don't want to be inconvenienced by being pregnant, but they want a child. So they hire a surrogate, to carry their husband's child. So then they may be the actual donor of the egg. In most cases, they are. But in that situation, I mean, again, think of all the various ways that this is just not right. This is not just right. There's something really, really wrong here, and it should cause our stomach, to kind of turn.
Yeah, I mean, it's disgusting. I don't want to be unnecessarily offensive, but it's grotesque practice. It seems like a sci-fi, thing. Like I said, Brave New World dreamt up almost 100 years ago.
So how do we rectify it? This is something, in this whole time that we've been going through with COVID and vaccines, and there's been many of us that have been talking about the biomedical industry and the commercialization of children, in the sense of elective abortion and the use of cells. And so this is not something that should be unheard of in a sense of our listenership and our readership of my column, is that I've talked about this many times before in other means. So the understanding is that, that life and the dignity of human life and the respect owed to every human person, is where we should have a conversation. And what is what has God intended in the sense of an engendering of a child? And where is this to be? And of course, it is very clear in the natural union of husband and wife, in the bonds of marriage, through the conjugal love of spouses, in the conjugal act, where they're open to the gift of human life, through the unity of their love and the transmission of life and the self-giving of each other to each other, with the understanding that we're welcome human life. This is the cell that God has created. This is how the family is created. And this is where, again, society is built upon. But now we've taken that and we have turned it into something that it is not. So we redefined it in our own language, in our own means. And in many cases, as I brought up earlier, is many times what we've seen is that these industries begin because there's a good they're trying to serve. Okay, so we want to start there, and that would be true. I mean, some people start with bad intent and bad desire, but in most cases, because science comes about and medicine comes about because they're trying to address an issue. They're trying to find a way to resolve an issue, a medical issue. It's a human issue, and so when you have infertility, so there's a couple of ways to approach it, which our church teaches about. And that we can maybe find what is maybe some of the underlying causes of that infertility. Is there a natural way to address those causes, which then would allow the couple to conceive naturally, a child? Or are there other means that are moral means, which the church does talk about, that are available to couples to help them, not to replace? So what's happened in vitro fertilization is the couple has been replaced by a third party. All right, so the generation of the child doesn't occur through the natural act of husband and wife, the conjugal act. A third party has replaced that. And so this is where we get into the immorality of it all. And so and this is the danger. So that's why if we can just pull back on those reins and not allow ourselves to get pulled into the emotion of the story. And these are emotional stories, and they're real stories, and they're painful stories. These are human stories. These are human beings. These are mothers. These are our sisters. These are our brothers and sisters in the womb. Some have already been born and sitting in maternity homes, waiting to be, welcomed, by the parents that, paid for that service.
The biological.
Or
some maybe not biological parents, the ones who are legally responsible.
So these children, they're vulnerable. They're left in this moment. So these are real stories, and I don't want us to come across, and I know that we're not, but these are real issues that need to be resolved. And we don't want to downplay the real pain that is in these stories.
But I think maybe what we're trying to emphasize is that it's created by the choice to do something unnatural and sinful in the first place, which is this process of surrogacy. So actually really starting with the IVF, etc., all of the things that go into this kind of manufacturing process.
So here would be Tad, so this is where we are. What do we do with it? But then the other part is, how do we prevent ourselves from being here again? And, what's interesting, as I mentioned in the article, is that there are, situations of countries where many refugees from Ukraine find themselves, and some of them are surrogate mothers, and it's illegal in those countries. This we consider human trafficking, so child trafficking. So what happens is that they can't stay there, and so if a couple or an individual, because it's not just couples that pay for surrogate, individuals, can donate their own sperm, donate their egg, and then have a donor, completely unknown to them, where they just want to be a parent. And so it's not just couples, same-sex couples, it's individuals that are also doing this. And then you also have, which is, again, you can see how this is got so many layers to it. So, but now what they have to go back to Ukraine, because it's one of the few countries, especially in Europe, that it's legal.
Back into war.
Back into the war zone. So they go back into danger to give birth to their child so that they can fulfill a contract. So this really should make everyone pause and realize this has to come to an end. It has to stop. But in order for that to stop, which many countries have done, they have made surrogacy illegal. It is illegal, and that's great. We need to continue to push for that to be a universal, and prevent this from ever happening. But the other thing is, we need to get down to the other issue, which is backing up in time and get to the whole in vitro fertilization industry, which is the only way surrogacy is possible is because of in vitro fertilization. So we need to get to that other layer where we say this is wrong. Children should not be, generated in such a manner. So, but that requires people to be resensitized, to the natural ends of marriage and to what God intends for marriage and within marriage and where children are to be engendered, welcomed. And so, but that's a bigger story, Tad, because we've lost that ear, in our age.
Well, I think it's a consistent theme, and what we talk about here is that, and what you write about is that we just we don't see human life as inherently sacred or dignified.
Right. That's right. And so when we don't understand marriage, when we don't understand the ends of marriage, when we don't understand, this unitive and procreative ends that when we don't understand the nature of marriage and the nature of the human person, these are when these, I would say, abominations, when these atrocities occur. And there's falsifications.
None of those terms don't apply to the children themselves.
No, by any means.
Not at all. Yeah.
That's very important. And it's good that we keep saying that, because I mean, sometimes people can, pick a certain clip.
Well, people will misconstrue or...
Exactly. No, no matter how this child has come into being does not diminish that child's dignity. And so we want to make that very clear. And I make that very clear in the column. And so, but it's good to keep repeating it. It's good to keep repeating it. And it's the same way we would speak, if I may make a little comma, that a person who gets into an older age state, or into maybe a dementia state, or into a difficulty of human life in the sense of moving through time and getting to where they're sickly, doesn't diminish their dignity. So we would say the same thing in every other way we speak of human persons. So same thing is applied here. But with all of that said, we need to say enough. This should not happen again. This should not make the headlines, because it should not be. We should not be in this situation. Children should not be in this situation. Our unborn brothers and sisters are not meant to be exploited. And women who are in these situations should not be there to be exploited. And we in the West, our own leadership in the West, our own country should put an end to this.
You might call it colonization of the womb.
Well, that's a good term. It's a good phrase, and it could very equally apply. And I've heard it used by some of our own church leaders, and some of our bishops actually have used similar terminology. And so this is a moment, and I'm hoping the column, it's gonna probably make a few people angry, because they may look at it and say, you should be a little more sensitive to the situation in Ukraine, and we are. This is, like I said, this is a real story, real human beings, people in difficult dilemmas, and they're suffering.
I think that's our whole emphasis, is that they are real human beings, so people should not have been treated this way in the first place.
So that's what the real issue is. So we got to get underneath it and realize that, well, why are they in these situations? Why are women feeling they have to rush back to Ukraine?
Even apart from the context of war, that's just the reason this comes to the headlines.
Exactly. And that's why we see the media picking it up, because they're using it from a different point and to make a different position.
And
please
go ahead.
continue.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on this one thing. This is kind of a thought I had about it, but it's very interesting that, I think we can largely say the mainstream media falls into this category, but at least anyone, the whatever you want to call it, the anti-life movement, or just the general culture of death. It's very odd that in this particular instance, they become, you might say, pro-natalist, right? In the case of artificial reproductive technology or surrogacy or anything, whereas for the most part, they're opposed to any kind of generation of children, right? Contraception, abortion, whatever you can have, that's not, natural, sexual act and generation. It's weird. It's like whatever's unnatural is the agenda to promote, right?
And that's a great insight, and I think it's and I'm hoping that people see that, that when you bring it up, and I think that when we consider, for example, when we look in our Western culture and we see where it's celebrated, where let's say in this situation a same-sex couple that is in the whole media industry or in the theater industry or in the movie industry, and the media picks it up and celebrates. Isn't it wonderful how they were able to have a child, and no one pauses and says, well, how did that happen? And so in a way the media wants to celebrate it, and they do, but then at the same time on the other side they're pro-abortion. They're pro women to make decisions to abort their child.
Why is it only a miracle of life in this case? Right?
Correct, and not in this case. Right. So there's the hypocrisy of it all, and so here again, what we want to do is just really put a pause and ask these moral questions, these ethical questions, and not that we're going to resolve it in this podcast, but the church has an answer, all right, and the answer is back to what is the very nature of human sexuality, what is the nature of marriage, the conjugal act, what has God intended, for where children are to be welcomed and engendered, and that's the conversation. And no one has a right to a child. A child is not a product. A child is not a thing. We're talking about a human being that has rights and rights of its own nature that as I mentioned earlier. And that's where the conversation must return. Now, to do that is going to take many podcasts, many people writing, and I have to say, there are many people writing on this. This subject should not be unheard from our pro-life audience. It's probably not heard by the other side of the aisle, but we within this movement need to talk about this more, because the understanding here, because you hear people say, for example, well, aren't we for life? So of course we are. And they will say, well, why don't we, promote, in vitro fertilization? It doesn't it bring life into this world? Aren't we for life? And the answer is, yes, we are for life. But.
And we're in we are for those individual lives who are being conceived completely against their will and against their better good, But this kind of manufacturing process is scientific.
But what we're saying is that, again, but no one has a right to this child. So we have to return back to the language that answers those kinds of questions, because those questions are posed all the time. Yes, we are for life, but the means by which we are welcome that life are very clear. And, and there are certain ways in which we say are not moral. And this is the part we have to keep talking about.
It's just like we would say it's not, adultery, conceiving a child in adultery. Well, that child is sacred. That child is pure. But
the means by which
that happened is a deeply sinful, deeply unfortunate
And that's
situation.
The part where we, as a pro-life movement, a pro-family movement, and, need to keep talking. We need to not be afraid to answer those kinds of questions or to address the inconsistencies in people's statements, and to address the fact that that's a falsification, that's being employed as a reason to justify an act. And so we need to be very clear so that, and unashamed of it. There's nothing that, we can be respectful, at the same time being very firm. But we do a very poor job of that in our arguments. And so as a result, the narrative continues to go the other direction because we don't stand against the narrative. So by writing the column, it has a two-pronged approach. One is just to spark people's interest. This is what's going on. Read deeper into the stories and realize why this is happening. And then the second prong is, how do we not have this kind of problem, not just in Ukraine, but how can we not have this issue in India or in Africa or in Latin America or in any other part of the world? And Ukraine is not the only place where it's legal. So how do we change laws that protect women from being exploited? How do we advance laws that protect children from being exploited and commodified, commercialized? And how do we change the conversation about, quote, the right to a child, which there is no right to a child? How do we change that narrative? And again, at the same time, what we began with, Tad, and that is, how do we address the real struggle of husbands and wives who are open to life and want to welcome a child in life and struggling with infertility? We have answers to that. We have responses to that. And we have many ways in which there is a moral means to help couples in certain situations like that. And what we haven't talked about here, obviously, is also the beauty and gift of adoption. And that's another subject that I'm going to talk more about later on in upcoming columns. But it's important that we, so there's other ways of which we can address these issues and still be of assistance in helping people to, I would use that word achieve. I don't like that word, but in a sense for a couple to find another answer so that they find that they are, after all those moral means are employed and they're still unable to conceive, maybe their heart can be open to the gift of welcoming a child through adoption. So there's so many ways, and that's part of the narrative. It's part of the conversation, but being sensitive, being pastoral, being firm in what is good and what is not, and what are the moral means and what are the immoral means. These are all part of our narrative that we need to not be afraid to speak about. And I'm very proud of many people who are in this conversation, many pro-life leaders, many family leaders, many even non-Catholic Christians and even non-Christian people are in this conversation about surrogacy and about the commercialization of children. And so it's great to see a lot of people in this conversation, trying to change the narrative. So I just would like to see more people do this. And I think we need to really denounce such behaviors and say, we don't want to be here again. We don't need to be in these situations again. And really let's look at the real issues and not allow the media to control the narrative, not allow, because that's an exploitation too. Just what they're doing is an exploitation. It just deepens the wound. Because but that's a different conversation.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, we could go on for days with this one. It's a huge, complicated topic, all kinds of layers. And I guess, it's just kind of a tragic situation. And we can think about all those frozen children, in the Petri dishes, the children conceived in this way, born, what kind of lives are they going to have, not necessarily knowing who their biological parents are or who the mother who, gestated them was or anything. It's all kinds of tragedies. So we better pray for all these souls.
And if I may, Tad, before we close, I think that, for us as a church and, is what is our response here? So, if a couple, who's sitting in our churches, in our pews and, is struggling, let's say with infertility, and we don't talk about, what's available in the sense of what are the moral means of which can help them, where could they turn? And so if all they hear is from the secular world, we have done them a horrible disservice and a harm. So we as a church need to talk about these. We need to find a way to bring this conversation, whether it be like I used to do in when I was in parish ministry, we talk about these things during the whole process of preparing for marriage, because these are the unknowns. These are things the couple does not know yet of what is forthcoming in their marital life. Will they struggle with infertility? Will they have difficulties conceiving a child? And so what happens in those moments? So we don't want to wait for the crisis. We have to be proactive. And so we need to talk about these things. And again, I think we need to do a better job of talking about marriage itself and the nature of marriage and the nature of conjugal love. And we're not doing a good service to this and to God's blessings and the beauty of human sexuality and the beauty of a child and the wonder of a child and the wonder of a human person. And we need to do a far, far better job of talking about this. And knowing that these kinds of things are out there should force us to do a better job so that we don't do this. We repent of these kinds of acts so that we can make better choices and really foster, a better appreciation of human life and a love of life and a love of marriage and a love of being a parent and a child, as you said very beautifully, Tad, that wants to be welcomed by their own parent, loved by their own parent, and to be educated and formed and raised. Think of all the layers of ambiguity of a child that wonders, how did I come into being? There's two men here. I mean, biology says there's no way that you can conceive a child. How did I come into existence? What happened? Who's my mother? And so lots of things. So it's not just as simple, as looking at it at its face value. It's getting underneath it and looking at all of the issues that come to bear and addressing each one of them. And if we do that honestly, then we won't be here again. And we'll put an end to these abuses, and we'll also put an end, to the abuse of the fundamental principle that is human dignity. So things you and I will talk about much more in detail as we go forward in time. Mm-hmm. So
right. Well, let's pray for that, and let's pray for the end of these horrible things. And I want to thank everyone for bearing with us and for tuning in to the Culture of Life podcast from Human Life International. Please follow us on all of our platforms. Subscribe on YouTube. Listen on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And we'd love to have you back again. Keep on living the culture of life. God bless.